In this video, we're going to talk about blind review, which is a tool that people use when studying for the law school admission test. If you've never heard of blind review before, or you've heard of it but you don't know what it is or how it works, or maybe you know what it is but you haven't tried it, this video is for you. If you've tried using blind review before, but you didn't find it particularly helpful, or you feel like you should somehow be getting more benefit from it than you've been getting, keep watching. We're going to say some things about blind review in this video that you may not have heard before. We're going to talk about what blind review is, how to do it, when to do it, why to do it. Blind review is a process that we use to review any type of timed work. So if you complete a full timed practice test, or an individual timed section, or some type of drill, like maybe you do a single reading comprehension passage with the questions, or a single logic game, or a set of logical reasoning questions. You can review any of this work using a blind review. Why do we call this blind review? It's called blind review because to do it correctly, you're going to review questions without knowing what the correct answer is. In fact, ideally, you won't even know if you answered a question correctly or not when you're reviewing it. You'll normally do a blind review before you check answers, before even checking your score. There are a few different ways to complete a blind review. We're going to talk about 3 different methods. The first method is what I'll call the whole shebang method. You just completed a full-time practice test or an individual timed section or a drill. Before you check answers, you're going to go back and review every single question untimed. This is how a lot of people complete a blind review. And I think it's also why a lot of people don't do a blind review, because they think this is how it's supposed to work, this whole shebang method. And this doesn't seem very useful or appealing. Before we talk about the other 2 methods, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this whole shebang method. One advantage of the whole shebang method is that it gives you the full benefit of timed practice along with the full benefit of untimed practice. And it's important to do both types of practice when you're preparing for the LSAT. Timed practice allows you to practice answering questions the way that you're going to do it on test day, under those very strict time conditions that we have to deal with. Untimed work allows you to work more slowly. You can think more carefully about the question that you're answering and understand the question more clearly. You can make sure that you're correctly following whatever process that you want to use to answer that question, whatever approach or method that you want to use. One advantage of this whole shebang approach is that you're getting to do both timed practice and untimed practice with a whole lot of questions. This helps you become very familiar with the different types of questions that you're going to see on the LSAT. You're going to be running a whole lot of questions past your brain, and you'll start to recognize patterns and tendencies that show up very frequently in these questions. And this can be especially helpful when you first start studying for the LSAT. So there are some disadvantages to this whole shebang approach. And the big one is that it takes a long time, especially if you're reviewing a full-time practice test. It already takes a couple of hours to do a full-time test. And then if you're going to go back and review every single question, that's going to take even longer. This could prevent you from spending time on other things that could actually be more useful. And a lot of times when people do this type of blind review, all they're really doing is going back and redoing the questions untimed. You might just repeat the exact same steps that you used the first time you answered the question. You just do it more slowly and see if you come up with a different answer. If you're just redoing the questions this way, you could end up repeating some of the same mistakes that you made the first time you answered a question. You could even end up reinforcing those mistakes, making it more likely that you're going to repeat them in the future, which is the opposite of what we want to do when we're doing any type of review. It helps to use a different thought process and have a different mindset when we're reviewing. When we're working under time conditions, we just want to choose the correct answer as efficiently as possible. That's all we really care about. When we review, it's an opportunity to think about how we're arriving at that answer. We can slow down and think about the exact process that we're following. We can notice what's working, what we're doing well, and we can also notice specific things that we want to improve. Also, when working under time conditions, I might not know exactly why an answer is correct. I might pick answer choice B without even really understanding why it's the correct answer, but I'm going to pick it because I'm 95% sure that each of the other 4 answers is wrong. When we review, it's an opportunity to be 100% clear about the question and each of the answer choices. I can take time to understand exactly why each incorrect answer choice is incorrect. I can take time to understand exactly why the correct answer is correct. I can do these things that I'm not necessarily going to take time to do when I'm working under time conditions. If your review process just involves redoing the questions more slowly, repeating the same steps that you followed the first time that you answered the question, you're not really taking advantage of this opportunity to thoroughly analyze and understand these questions. So going back to this whole shebang method of blind review, when you're reviewing a very, very large number of questions, it's easy to fall into that habit of just redoing the questions, just redoing them more slowly to see if you come up with a different answer, rather than taking advantage of this opportunity to analyze questions more carefully. So those are some disadvantages of this whole shebang approach, and honestly, some things that we want to keep in mind no matter what type of review we're doing. A different way of doing a blind review is what I'm going to call the "what did I do wrong" approach. With this method, you would actually check answers after you finish your timed work and see which questions you answered incorrectly. And then you go back and review those questions, just the questions that you answered incorrectly. Ideally, you would still do this without knowing what the correct answer is to each question that you review. It's still going to be a blind review in that way. There are a couple of advantages to this "what did I do wrong" approach. You'll probably review a smaller number of questions this way. And you're just focusing on the questions that you answered incorrectly. So these are probably going to be questions that were the most challenging for you, questions that you didn't understand as well as other questions. So you're just focusing your review on those particular questions. What are the disadvantages of this "what did I do wrong" approach? If you've been studying for the LSAT for any length of time, you've probably been in a situation where you've eliminated 3 answer choices and you just have 2 answer choices remaining. And then you have trouble making the final decision between those 2 answer choices. A lot of people will say, I always narrow it down to 2 answers, and then I always pick the wrong one. The truth is, there are probably a lot of times where you narrow a question down to 2 answer choices, and then you pick the correct answer. You might not even be aware of how often you do this if you're only focusing on the questions that you answer incorrectly, if you're only reviewing those questions. There could be a bunch of questions where you narrow the answer choices down to 2, and maybe you have trouble deciding between those 2 answers, but you do pick the correct answer. But those are still challenging questions for you. There's still a lot of things that you could learn from reviewing those questions. If you do review these questions that we're talking about right now, these questions that you find difficult, but where you do ultimately pick the correct answer, by reviewing these questions and getting a better understanding of them, when you see a similar question in the future, you're maybe going to spend less time answering that question. And of course, that's probably what most people are looking for on the LSAT. We'd all like to spend less time answering questions and still get them correct. This is one way to help yourself learn to work more quickly and efficiently. Review questions that you answered correctly, but ones that slowed you down. The "what did I do wrong" method is better than not reviewing at all, but it doesn't really provide the very useful opportunity to review these types of questions that we're talking about right now. This brings us to our third way of doing a blind review. It's what I'm going to call a selective blind review. With this method, you personally select the questions that you want to review. You don't have to review every single question, and you're not just going to focus on questions that you answered incorrectly. Ideally, when you do a selective blind review, like we said earlier, you won't even know which questions you answered correctly or incorrectly. You're going to do this before you even check your score. So how do you know which questions to select? That's really up to you. You can review any question that seemed difficult, any question that really slowed you down, any question where you feel like you got stuck and you weren't really sure what to do next. And of course, you can review those questions where you narrowed things down to 2 answers and then you had trouble making the final decision between those 2 answers. These are all fantastic questions to review. If you're scoring in the high 160s or 170s, set the bar really high for yourself. Review any question where you are not 100% certain of the answer that you chose. Review any question that seemed to slow you down a little bit. If you have the feeling that there might have been a better way to set up a logic game, or you think you might have missed an important detail in a reading comprehension passage when you were first reading it, review that. Go back and do a blind review of that passage or that game. So how exactly do you do this? How exactly do you pick these questions to review? Well, there are a couple of ways to do it. If you're practicing in LawHub or on another platform that lets you flag questions, you can just flag the questions that you want to go back and review. In some cases, you won't be able to go back and see the questions that you flagged without also seeing the correct answers. And that's kind of a bummer. It's not the way we want to do things. But there are other ways that you can mark questions for review. After you complete a timed test or section or drill, before you check answers, you can go back and quickly look through the questions and make a list of the ones that you want to review. You can also create this list while you're working under time conditions. You're probably going to have some scrap paper with you while you're practicing. So on one part of your scrap paper, like along one edge, just make a list of the questions from that section or that drill that you want to review. Every time you see a question and you say, oh, I'd really like to review this question, just write the number of that question down on your list. Now, you might be thinking, I don't have time for that. When I'm working under time conditions, I don't have time to write down the number of questions that I want to review. So honestly, if you're that stressed about time, I actually think it's a really good idea for you to do this exercise. Every time you have trouble with a question, pause, write down the number of that question, and then take a deep breath, let it out, and then go on to the next question. It's only going to take a couple of seconds to write that question down and take a deep breath. But by doing that, it might actually help you focus and work more effectively on that next question that you're going to work on. When we start to feel panicked or stressed about time, a lot of the critical thinking and reasoning skills that we need to do well on the LSAT go right out the window. Your brain just stops doing those things. So learning how and when to slow yourself down a little bit, maybe taking a deep breath when you start to feel stressed. These kinds of techniques can be incredibly powerful when you're practicing for the LSAT and on exam day. Give this a try the next time you're practicing. See if it helps. Once you finish your timed work and you have your list of questions to review, take your time, go through each question and review it. And remember, we're using a different thought process, not necessarily the same thought process that we use when we're working under time conditions. Think about the exact process that you use to answer each question. What are you doing well? And what are things that you specifically want to improve, things you specifically want to do differently? Take the time to understand each passage, each game. Take the time to understand each question. Notice exactly what makes each answer choice incorrect, if it's a wrong answer, and understand exactly what makes the correct answer correct. This selective blind review method has the advantage of the what did I do wrong method in that you'll probably review a smaller number of questions. It also has the advantage of the whole shebang method in that you're not just reviewing questions that you answered incorrectly. You're taking the time to review questions that you answered correctly, but that you still might be able to learn something from. So what are the disadvantages of a selective blind review? I don't know. I kind of like it. I think this is the best way to do a blind review. Some people don't like to do blind review because they're using the whole shebang method or the what did I do wrong method, and they're seeing the disadvantages of those methods. I think this selective blind review method actually addresses those disadvantages really well. If you're just starting out on your LSAT journey and you're reviewing one of your first practice tests using this selective blind review method, you might choose a whole lot of questions to review. It might seem a lot like the whole shebang method. And that's okay. You can go ahead and review all those questions if you want to. Or you can look at your list of questions to review and choose a smaller subset of questions and just review those. A lot of it depends on your schedule and what's going to work best for you. The number of questions that you actually review might depend on the amount of time you have and how much time you want to invest in this blind review process. You can very easily adjust the number of questions you review based on what your needs are and what your schedule allows. We've talked about 3 different ways to complete a blind review. There's the whole shebang method, the what did I do wrong method, and selective blind review. Each one of these has advantages. You might decide to do a whole shebang review with a particular section or test, and you might decide to use the what did I do wrong method every once in a while. The important thing is to understand the advantages and disadvantages of each method and to understand what you can actually gain by doing an effective blind review. Before we go, it's worth mentioning that you don't have to do your review immediately after you complete your timed work. In fact, most of the time, I think it's a good idea to take at least a short break before you review. And if you do a full practice test one day and then you review it the next day, that's totally fine. If you do a timed section in the morning and then you review it that afternoon, that works great. I don't think it's a good idea to wait too long before you do your review, but you can certainly make some adjustments based on what fits your schedule. I'm making a few other short videos about blind review. In one, we're going to talk about your blind review score and what to do with that. In another video, I'm going to talk about how to do a blind review in Law Hub. I'm also making a video about celebrating your wins and why that's such an important thing to do when you're studying for the LSAT. If you go to my website, scottmillercoaching.com/LSAT, you can fill out a short form and download a PDF I created called How to Blind Review Each Section of the LSAT. This document contains some quick but useful tips that you can use when you're reviewing each individual section of the test. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel and share this with your friends who are studying for the LSAT. Thanks for watching.